as it did me because I thought I was about to get booted from the meeting, but it's all okay. So if you got that notification, it's all good. But with that, I just want to say hello and welcome everybody. This is our virtual roundtable on engineering ROI, metrics, and storytelling to help you advocate for resources. For those we haven't had a chance to meet yet, I'm Patrick Gallagher. I'm ELC's head of experience. What that means is I support all of our community's programs and content, including co-hosting our podcast, the Engineering Leadership Podcast, and Engineering Founders. Joining us, we've got Vitaly Gordon, co-founder and CEO at faros.ai, and Mustafa, Furniturewala, SVP of Engineering at Coursera, both of whom spend a ton of time and effort on the problem space that we're going to be discussing today. So they have a ton to share, a lot of stories, context, approaches, strategies. And so you're probably wondering, why are we here? Well, simply put, if you don't take ownership of the story of your engineering organization, the business will do it for you. And so today is all about how you can measure success and tell the story of engineering and use those metrics and stories to advocate for the right investments in engineering. That's what we're after today. And so with that, some background context about faros.ai. So this event is co-hosted with our friends at faros.ai, and what they do and why it's relevant to this specific conversation. They integrate all your engineering data sources to give you a holistic visibility into the entire software development lifecycle. So they help take the guesswork out of some of the planning so that you can make decisions, allocate resources, and improve productivity. So all of the things that we're talking about here of like metrics, storytelling, advocating for resources is the problem space that they spend a lot of time thinking about. So super grateful that they're a part of this conversation with us. So one more quick announcement. So what's going to drive a lot of this conversation are your challenges and your scenarios. So please share those in the chat. We'll also have time for folks to jump in and get in discussion as well. I know a lot of folks have shared questions. Vitaly's got them pulled up as well, so we'll be diving into those. Two final things that you need to know. How to get the most from this experience is, number one, share the most important challenges that you are facing. Vulnerability is the accelerant to all relationships. So this place is where you can talk about the stuff where you can't share with your team or company. This is the space for that. The second is, what you give is what you get. So when you hear a challenge, like, also you offer your stories in the chat, connect with somebody offline to see if you can help them out. That's how we help each other solve problems, is sharing and supporting. I think that's it. In terms of the prep, Jerry told you about the chat. It's evergreen. He told you about how to find people. Some quick Q&A. Q&A housekeeping. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we can pull you up. We just ask that you keep yourself on mute until we pull you up for the question, because that just helps eliminate some of the background noise that happens in the meeting. I think that's the last piece of logistics here. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome up Vitaly Gordon and Mustafa Furniturewala. Vitaly, Mustafa, thank you both so much for joining us and helping create this conversation. So I'll turn it over to you both to set the context and dive in.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, thank you for having us. Everyone, thank you for taking the time of your busy day to be here with us today. So maybe I'll start with just adding a little bit about background, and then Mustafa, you can also introduce yourself, and maybe the first question I would be curious also to hear is kind of how the journey about kind of developer productivity started Coursera. But before we begin, folks, like was just mentioned, I'm the co-founder and CEO of faros.ai. But prior to that, I was VP engineering at Salesforce, running engineering for their machine learning platform called Einstein. And this is where I got my kind of view into the world of engineering, kind of leadership and data around, and just how different engineering is compared to other functions in a large company. I'm talking about, whether it's sales, marketing, finance, all these functions are far, far more data driven than engineering. And if you look and think about it for a second, like, that gap cannot be explained by a skills gap, because, usually all the people in the engineering organization come from STEM background and obviously deal with data day in, day out, but still the function is not running. So that is something that a journey I started while at Salesforce. Then after that, kind of typical to a Silicon Valley founder cliche, decided to start a company around that space. And that's how I also got to meet Mustafa, where as one of our kind of early customers and partners. But maybe Mustafa, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of when and how did you start in that journey?
Yeah, thanks, Vitali, and hi everyone. So I head the engineering team at Coursera. I've been there for more than 9 years now, and the journey started actually of like specific to engineering productivity. It started with just defining what the engineering vision is, and I can send a link later. But I've blogged about this on the Coursera engineering blog of how to create an engineering vision and the process behind that. But we have a lot of data, and we think very like naturally about like going to amplitude or segment about product metrics. But I found it very challenging to have that kind of insight into engineering systems and engineering productivity metrics, right? And we had all sorts of things from like scripts in GitHub to get data and then analyze it, or even had very complicated sumo logic queries to look through logs. And those queries I used to get up every Monday in the week and like press run, and then it would take 2 hours, and I would come back after 2 hours, and I was like, okay, we need a better solution for this, because it was hard to get any insight into engineering metrics, right? And I noticed this problem, after we reached about like more than 80 people. Is that's the time we had the scale where we needed a bit more insight into productivity and other metrics in engineering at scale. So that's when I was like trying to look for tools, and where I can have the flexibility to create metrics. It's fast. It has all the data in there, and I can use it somewhat like Amplitude for product, but for engineering. And we looked at a bunch of tools, and we ended up using Faros, and we have like a lot of dashboards. And what we do now is we link our engineering vision, which has North Star metrics, which I also then share with the exec team. And that dashboard is in Faros, in a Faros dashboard, right? So those are like live metrics, and I can look at it by like 1 year or like whatever time frame, and it's very quick. And then the thing I love is also I can drill down and compare by groups. And we can talk about this more, but the more you compare individually, I think the harder it is to like get the right insights into the data. So the group level comparisons are found to be more useful in finding patterns of like, okay, this team is probably facing some hurdles, so let's get more insight. So that's just a quick background on the journey. I'll pause there, Vitali, to see if you want
Yeah,
me to
so
add anything else.
thank you for sharing this. But one of the kind of interesting, especially you, as you mentioned, you folks started fairly early on. If around 80 engineers, and from just a quick overview, there's many engineering leaders here from organizations that are much larger, and perhaps didn't start their journey. How in the early days you kind of convince management that, hey, you know what, at 80 engineers, every single engineer is already a percentage of the total engineering force, like to kind of focus on that as opposed to like having them develop newer and better Coursera features.
Yeah, so if you go back to like Coursera culture very early, I think we were in the bucket of like we were already deploying to production very frequently. So it was at the order of like 70 times a week, or something of that nature, right? So our problem wasn't necessarily that, okay, we need to get like more deploys. I think it was more about like, how do we do this more efficiently and make sure we have the right checks and balances as we scale? Because what we started seeing is we started seeing some impact on availability and quality, because we were moving very fast. And so that's why very early we started investing in some of the SRE principles, implementing SLIs, SLOs. So that was where we convinced like the exec team and the management team, if you will, to invest in this. Um, and partly it's like convincing myself as well. So I personally find a lot of value in being able to run an engineering organization in having those metrics, because it really clarifies what the North Star is and gives insight into how you're making progress.
Got it. Yeah, sorry, folks. I disappeared there for a second. I'm not sure what happened. But in case you haven't touch on this. Heard you talking about kind of, so it wasn't so much focusing on the initial, deployments. You folks were already deploying frequently to production. So what was this, initial set of metrics that kind of you folks decided to focus on?
Yeah, so the two main metrics that we focused on was availability. So as I mentioned, we did have some availability challenges about 6 years ago, and then in the pandemic, uh, when our traffic grew quite a bit, like that became even more urgent. So that was one of the metrics we were tracking, and the second relevant one for us was cycle time because we have a microservice architecture. But I'm sure a lot of you might have faced this is you end up having like a distributed monolith instead of a microservice architecture. So we ran into that initially as well. And so as we grew, we started seeing bottlenecks in engineering productivity. So there were two buckets here that we wanted to investigate. One was, well, on the architecture itself, right? What are the fitness functions that we need to look into to make sure that as we're growing, these microservices are enabling us to actually move as autonomous teams, right? It solves an organizational challenge more than the other challenges that we had, and so that's one thing we focused on, and I can talk more about that. But the other aspect that we focused on is, okay, let's look at the entire developer workflow and dive a little bit deeper into cycle time, find the input metrics into cycle time. Is it the PR size? Is it like something else that's causing this? And is it like inter-team dependencies that is causing this? So we drove deeper into the cycle time metric. One interesting metric we had here is the amount of code that is being contributed to a team's component from another team, right? And again, like our goal was not that like each team has their own code and no one can contribute to each other's code base, but it gave us a proxy metric into those autonomous teams that I was talking about. So yeah, those were the two metrics. I would also say another one was change failure rate because it has an impact on availability. So we wanted to make sure track how many bad deploys are going out. And that actually drove investments into end-to-end tests and unit testing and also things like automated canary analysis and things like that helped us, still have that deploy frequency, but with some more checks.
Yeah, so actually, I want to kind of add something to your point, because one of the great thing about having the job I have and working with leaders like Mustafa and other kind of leading companies is that we get to learn a lot from kind of how the best team look like, and we have the data about the kind of the best teams and how other teams. And one of the things that so I kind of mentioned it kind of as a by the way, but I just think it's such an important point, is kind of not treating kind of engineering trends as the end, but it's just a mean towards a goal. So for example, you mentioned microservices, and you're absolutely correct. Like microservices is actually not solving a technology problem. It actually makes technology, kind of harder, right? It's solving an organization problem. But having that mindset that every single one of these trends that you hear, whether it's microservice, serverless, Kubernetes, GitHub Copilot is now becoming one of them. They're all kind of solutions to a certain problem, and it's very important to kind of think about what is that problem that you're trying to solve for. And like Mustafa mentioned, in most cases, there is a metric that can actually indicate. And one of the things that we did and was a kind of huge change for us when I was at Salesforce is, back, this is pre-COVID, people used to go to conferences and come back and like, oh my God, I was like at this session and there was like some Uber or Airbnb or Google engineer and they were talking about their newest thing and we should completely adopt it. And I used to ask them, okay, what is the problem that you're solving? Can you show me of all the metrics that we track, like which metric do you think that, it will move? And then, a lot of the cases is actually was people just didn't come back. It was kind of my way to tell him, hey, just, it's great that you have ideas, but like, let's not now spend all of our time and effort on, kind of chasing something that probably would not move the needle. But when people actually did that work and put effort into thinking about, oh, you know what, this is actually the metric. It can be anything from build time or like Mustafa mentioned, like, cross dependency. So like, for example, with one of our customers that we work with, we found, Mustafa, that there was, I think, the cycle time was like about 10 times larger if there was like cross team dependency, right? Because if like you had to wait on another team to like review code, again, I don't know how much of it is like towards politics versus actual like issues with the company, but it's just crazy. And just like actually kind of understanding and, like you said, having all the data available and kind of trying to investigate that is kind of very helpful. But maybe let's kind of talk about it as part of kind of your job as well is talking to other engineering leaders about kind of how they approach the things. This is kind of part of this conversation and something that we also ask you to talk to our other customers often. What do you think like people get wrong about when they start kind of thinking about developer productivity? Like what mistakes should be avoided?
Yeah, so I think one common mistake is that you have to kind of start with the goal, right? Is the goal to present to the exec team, or is this to actually solve productivity challenges within engineering, or is it to find performance issues in your team, right? It varies so much, and so if you're not clear of the goal, I think you'll end up going in sort of like the wrong direction, because you start measuring it, and before you know it, you'll drive some incentives in your team that's like driving the wrong culture, and now it's hard to undo those cultural things once you roll these things out. So I think that's the number one thing I've noticed is just being very intentional, because yes, there's Dora metrics, there is Space is the other framework. You can do that, but I think you need to be very, very intentional on how you're using it, what you're using it for, and also making sure, like you said, Vitaly, like what are the other input metrics that are like driving these things in the wrong direction. Yeah, that would be the number one thing, and then maybe the second thing is it needs to be tailored to the audience that you're sharing it to. So what engineering cares about, what your team cares about, will be very different than what the CEO cares about, for example. And so it can range all the way from like, okay, like detailed cycle time metrics to like, okay, a capitalization view that can be very different, and they can all sort of work together as a system. But what you want to share and how you want to present the story matters a lot as well.
Yeah, so actually, you're kind of in a very interesting position, maybe to um, ask this question, because you're both as a head of engineering, you have people present you data when they come, let's say, to ask for resources, but also you as a head of a function at a public company, there is usually kind of somewhat of a zero sum game of like this annual budgeting that you need to advocate for yourself. And if you can talk a little bit about like what is it that you're looking when kind of your VPs and directors coming to you for asking more resources, and what are some of the things that you are focusing on when you present to kind of, let's say, the CEO and the kind of finance team?
Yeah. Um, So the first thing it does start with, and thankfully, this happens very well at Coursera, is like you have to make sure you're integrated into the business strategy conversations as well. Because I do think, even though these are like engineering level metrics, when you are, especially when you're presenting to the exec team, it needs to be tied to the business strategy. So that's really where I start with, like, what is the key strategic thesis for Coursera in this case, right? And then work with the product team after that to figure out, okay, what are the products uh, enablement that we need to do? What is the key strategic things in product that we need to do, and where are the gaps? And then one of the frameworks we use is this 2x2 framework of like, where are we doubling down, where are we experimenting, where are we doing maintenance and keep the lights on, and then where are we actually deprecating and divesting from, right? And getting cross-functional alignment on that from everyone, if you have GMs in your organization, to design to product, on that, like some high-level framework is important. And then you start mapping things to that framework, and present it as like, okay, this is how we are allocating all the R&D efforts. Another aspect that you do need to present is, I have an engineering vision, and I have about like 20% allocated to that. And that's an overall story I present is that, okay, irrespective of what we do, there are some engineering foundational things, including developer tooling, including, maintaining the availability of the systems and including like making cost optimizations in your cloud systems, right? That you have to allocate to. And I have an alignment that's roughly like 20%, and I share that upfront. And then I give insight into like, okay, what are the key metrics and how am I tracking that? So that's how I think about allocation. Generally, is start with the business strategy, tie everything to that, and then have some story on the engineering investments.
Awesome, thank you. So we can also maybe open up to questions if we haven't touched on them, and let's say kind of being a little bit more specific. I think there's a request here from Padma to share the 2x2 framework, but let's start with a kind of Ankur. Let's see if I understand your question, or maybe if you want to ask it kind of directly. Is like, at what point, let's say, if, Mustafa, I'm one of your directors, and I come and say, hey, you know what, I need more resources, and you like, what is the framework that you use in order to say, well, like, are you just throwing good money after bad money, or like, is it really a team that does need more resources, and they're kind of already achieve whatever they can achieve, kind of using the resources they have? So how would you go about answering that?
Yeah, and Padma, I can share it. Like for some reason, my chat is disabled, and when I try to complete my profile, I have to upload my picture. So I'll do that later, but I'll share. I'll definitely share the link. So I even in that question, right, Vitali, I do start with the 2x2. Okay, like if you want to invest more in this, which of those like four quadrants does it fit into? Are we doubling down? Are we experimenting? And if we are experimenting, why do we need to like scale this right now before we actually find product market fit, or have some metrics to prove that we want to double down, and have some change management across cross functionally before we do that? The second thing, so once we do that, that's the first question. The second thing I look into is um, what's the team health like, right? And that goes from everything to like people on the team to like, okay, are they running into like architectural challenges? Are they like there are four buckets of this. This is like, I've got this from, I think the book is called Team Topologies. There's like many different kinds of teams, and there can be teams which are like, they have so much tech that they can't even do like any product work. They just like treading tech debt. There are some teams that can only do P1s, and there are some teams that are innovating. So you want the innovating teams generally. So I try to figure out, okay, which bucket does this team fall into? Because for each of those, there are different strategies, right? And before I get confidence that this team is in a healthy state, adding more people is not necessarily going to solve the problem here, right? In some cases, actually, it makes it worse. So I ask some questions, and I go back to those metrics and dashboards that we have on the team to understand team health, and make sure that's good. And then lastly, there is budget constraints. This is, like you said, it's a zero sum thing. So there is like, real constraints. So I take all of that input and then talk to my cross-functional partners on trade-offs we can make, and what is the right time to do it, right? It might not necessarily be an urgent thing. So change management is important here. So you either do it at quarterly boundaries or, at 1 year boundaries. But get alignment with the product team on trade-offs here, and share with them even technical challenges that are causing these, trade-offs, right? Because you want to invest in this feature, but until you fix this debt, you cannot invest in this feature. So having that kind of conversation with your product manager is important. And then once you align, then you can make, like, let's assume you don't have extra dollars. Then it's about trading off from, different areas and investing more in one versus the other.
Yeah, and I would just add here, from again our experience and the fact that we now work with many companies and see data across it. And like Mustafa said, especially in this environment that we're in, with higher interest rates than the ones we were used to in the last several years, budgets are just hard to come by. And what we are But what the thing that we are seeing is, in order to ask for any additional budget, you first need to justify that you are actually doing, well with the budget that you currently have. Because look, the reality is there is some companies are even, now cutting budgets, right? And we're hearing about layoffs almost like every day now. So I think like what is also very clear from our data is that the teams, and even on the team level, the teams that are getting additional budgets are the teams that are just performing well, and those are people like Mustafa or myself at my position as the CEO of a company. Like obviously we want to, as kind of capital allocator, we want to allocate the capital to the leaders who proven that they can do the most with that capital, as opposed to people that struggle to leverage the most out of it. So that's kind of just the reality. Let's kind of jump to Brendan's question, and maybe again, Brendan, I feel that we're gonna hear maybe Mustafa going again for his 2x2, but I'll let you ask the question.
Great. Yeah. I appreciate the comments about intentionality. I think are really important here. What I'm getting to is like, we in engineering have what we think of as our like productivity metrics, and we tell a story and try to connect that to the business. But I think other parts of the business will have their own ways of thinking, their own frameworks, their own stories that they're telling. And it's super important to like connect with these other sides of the business, right? That what engineering doing is leading to the greatest impact in the business. And I guess that's where I'm trying to take my question here, which is, things like the DORA metrics, I really appreciate. But I'm almost afraid that it goes the way of Agile, where it's like it just becomes this very prescriptive thing. I'm thinking of Goodhart's law, where like, the moment a metric becomes a target, it's easy to be a good metric. There's some of that risk in how we adopt these metrics. And so I'm trying to come back to how do we, we have these assumptions that we're basing our metrics on about what will have impact for the business. How do we really trace it to those really key outcomes for the business to prove out our assumptions and ultimately win like the buy-in of our stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brandon. So, in terms of combining these, and you're right, different functions have different stories that they want to tell and different frameworks as well at times. So again, like the 2x2 I shared is one way to like combine those frameworks, but in general, the way you share these stories, like what I've found to be effective is that um, even at the org, let's start with the org structure level, right? You can think of it as a system of teams that are delivering the impact that you intend to deliver for the business, right? And no org structure is perfect. But why it's important is, you have these groups of teams that have metrics, and then those metrics tie to some output metrics, right? So there's this thing we've started doing, which is called a metrics tree, that basically starts from like revenue can be at the top of the tree. And then you have an input metric, which might be like monthly active learners. And then there is another input metric, which is like monthly active learners using some generative AI product. You can imagine like a tree of input metrics that go. And so that metric tree is then mapped into the org structure. And so you can see this as working as a system. And the reason I'm sharing this is because the effective way of doing this is like sharing each pod and not just sharing like DORA metrics, but sharing, okay, here is a pod. This is the input metric they're driving, which maps to an output metric in the company OKRs. These are the projects that we're doing in this pod to drive that input metric. This is the impact it's already had. And then you can then use the metrics tree to drive the story back to revenue. And within this pod template, if you will, right? You also share other metrics like availability and some high level engineering metrics as well, to sort of complete the story of like, together, this is what's driving the impact around these input metrics. It's not just that we have to just launch this project, right? There are some other investments that we have to make. So I think that then brings design, product, and engineering, which is, I think, like, at least from my angle, the most critical to get together. in terms of sharing that story, and also is helpful to tie it to the company OKRs or company vision, whatever you have, whatever framework you have in the company.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
I'll just add to Mustafa that we're um, like it's also, folks, be careful not to a little bit overcorrect, because what we also have seen is there is some engineering organization that are trying a little bit too hard to kind of tie in, like, every single PR that the developer's done to like some top level revenue metric and kind of things like that. And it's just a very unnatural thing to do, because engineering in its kind of essence, it's a kind of a forward investment that will not yield results immediately, and definitely if it once it yields results, you will never be able to attribute to a specific line of code that kind of yielded that outcome. So this is where I would just say there is kind of a happy medium there of things that you actually can control, because I imagine many of you can work at platform engineering team, kind of DevOps teams. Like, not every single thing can be immediately associated to revenue or kind of business metrics, and still probably the things that you can control is just how well you run your organizations, right? And that is in most cases it's actually incredibly easy to be much better than the average. That's kind of just how it goes.
That's a great point. I completely agree with that, Vitaly. In fact, when I do this, Brandon, I also try to do this at the group level versus like each pod. And I tend to not have, especially with cross-functional partners, don't have question on like, should there be 2 people here or 3 people there? And that level of it's more about, let's trade off between should we be doing this versus this, and not about like leave that to me, right? I will handle that. So I think that's super important. The other thing I do is to not map everything to the metric. Is there is like almost a 10% innovation bucket, and it's important to not have that be just like one team does that, but there is a bunch of things that you're just doing, you know, with some conviction on some hypothesis, right? The hypothesis is still important, but it's not going to tie to necessarily to some input output metric in all cases.
Great, makes sense. Thank you.
Let's see, do we have someone coming up, Patrick? Or
Yep, we have Padma ready to jump in, so
Yeah.
I'm going to bring her up right now. Padma, jump on in with your question.
Hey, yes, I think this was really helpful. So we talked about a couple of concepts. One is this: how do you communicate engineering initiatives? Why prioritize something? What are we going to deprioritize, deprecate? So that template matrix you talked about is very helpful. And then the whole talking about, I think, using the metric again to define that, right? The trade-offs and the payoffs and the scope, and why is this scope versus the other scope. The second I think I heard was about the health. System health is obviously one thing we all track, but also engineering health, as in the developer experience and productivity metrics. And some of them are more internal focused than really suitable for a business audience. I think my question really was around, well, this is happening. Let's say we have the prioritization, we have agreement from business. We are tracking closely, right? The developers are productive as much as they can, and we're doing continuous improvements. How do you communicate progress back? So the example I want to use is like multiple projects. I've done like a monolith to a microservice, or converting from like Ember to React. And these are not overnight projects. These take 6 months, a year, 18 months, 2 years, and we know that upfront. And we're doing this along with many other things, right? We have a lot of roadmap. Any engineering team has many initiatives going on. So sometimes I'm asked, like, how much percentage is on? And it's like, okay, I don't know. And because engineering work is not very even. You do the hard work up front, like you make 2 platforms work together, or you do a microservice foundation. That's like your really tough work that you do, and then it's getting easier as you go ahead, and then maybe the last 20% will never be done, right? It doesn't matter. That's like low priority code that you may never end up converting. So it's not like sales, right? A deal is a deal, and one person does a deal, and that's the amount you get, and that's done. Engineering is not like that. It's a high value prop. It's also slow. And there's latency in finding out the benefits of the work. So I think really my question is, how do you communicate progress in a meaningful way to business, especially when you're in the middle of a multi-year project that is not very easily visible?
Yeah, and I can start. on this as well. And so I do think it's contextual, Padma. It's a tough question because it's very contextual on like different scenarios and different projects, right? But I'll give you some like high level thoughts on different areas and how to communicate on that, right? That I've seen work pretty well. One underlying thing that you might want to do is find the root cause, right? So for as an example, when we share dates of completion on engineering, right? I I always keep those as it's an estimated internal date and not to be shared externally, right? Even when AWS has an outage, right? And they're like, they don't actually give you a time when they'll resolve it. They're like, we're working on it, right? Is the answer. And that's the honest answer, right? And I get questions internally like, how can AWS do that? How can they not know when it will get fixed? The reality is, they're debugging something and, it takes time, right? So to figure out what the root cause might be. So finding that underlying cause might be good first is like, are these dates being promised to someone who's like, there's not like realistic dates? And in terms of communicating, I think it depends on the project. So for some projects which are, have too much ambiguity, they're not functioning well, I communicate. It can go from anywhere from like every 2 hours where there's an incident in progress and I just need to be very frequent to a quarterly business review, right? Which is like, okay, these are the high level things we're doing. Here is how the quarter went and how we made progress on it, right? And then there is stuff in between as well. There might be like bi-weekly things. But on average, it's like we have this thing called a quarterly business review where we share, these are the projects. This is how we did. This is our reflection. And what we've learned works well is actually we start with the exec summary on these things. Like this is what went well and this is what we would do differently based on what we learned, right? And so because those are the discussions that are valuable to have with the exec team, right? So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question with enough detail, but yeah, just wanted to give you different examples there.
Yeah, so I can also jump in from at least things that work, well enough personally for me, and something that prior to Salesforce I was also at LinkedIn, and basically there is this framework for any type of project that you want to do. I think, or people who work under you want to do. I think the best way is just to ask them to say, hey, what would be the impact of that project? And the impact is not necessarily revenue. It's any impact, whatever it is, right? And what it forces the people who ask for this additional resources or time or something like that is to give you an honest answer. Because here's the thing: if they underestimate the impact, then the project will not get funded, right? Because like we have bigger fish to fry. If they overestimate the impact, then maybe kind of the first time they will get their project funded, but the second time it will be much harder. And as a leader, if that's where the question was coming from, you kind of will learn to kind of recognize which are kind of the leaders are better at least estimating impact and time and kind of things like that, and which leaders are just are overly optimistic in their evaluation. And at least whenever we kind of have done it in the organization I've been a part of, I think that created a good culture of providing like good estimates, because everyone knew that they didn't want to underestimate, that they didn't want to overestimate.
Thank you. So I think not all projects are equal, right? So upfront being very vocal about the value of the project, right? And then using that same thread to talk about progress. And the exec summary makes sense, and then learnings make sense. And then just articulating the journey and having good estimations, good prioritization. Yeah, I think doing all this upfront is where the focus needs to be, and then the execution then becomes a bit more straightforward. Thank you.
All right, Omer, are you ready? We got another question coming up. Jumping on in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so interesting enough, I've had the opportunity of using some of the engineering metrics tools, but my question is around, in your experience, Vitaly, and maybe this is more of a question for Vitaly, what size of engineering orgs have you seen or companies have you seen the adoption work well for engineering metrics? And then I think there's a story to be told in terms of working with the stakeholders, but also with the engineering teams as well, right? Because initially the use tends to be a little bit of reluctance in terms of adopting it. So, what's your experience been in terms of what that narrative and story looks like?
Yeah. So, look, I'll start with while there is a kind of I can put some number size or 100 engineers plus or something like that. The reality is, it's much more dependent on the leaders. Like like you heard from Mustafa, he started earlier, and then we have some people who much later in terms of like the size of the org, they're still not using. I think it's you know I think it's really important on what is the trying to solve, because let's say if you're trying to solve like Mustafa just mentioned maybe cross team collaboration and kind of organizational issues, that obviously those issues start appearing much later in a kind of course of the company, right? If you're trying to figure out about like initiatives around like digital transformation or like kind of redoing like a stack, like these are again not issues. But if you're kind of more saying like what the conversation we just had with Padma about, like, hey, I just want to establish kind of a culture of accountability. When people say something, they do something, and I just want to track it, then that is something that probably you can start much earlier, right? And like I can tell you, we're about now 40 people, but about like I don't know 20 of them are kind of engineering, and we do have kind of every quarter we get in and we use our software for that and say, hey, you know what? Here's the budget that we have allocated for keeping the lights on for customer work and for new feature development. Let's say these are the top three buckets. And I'm now, as a CEO of a company, I want to make sure that we actually are allocating the resources accordingly. So, for example, sometimes it happens that we have a slew of customer requests, and obviously the customer experience team comes in and asks the engineers, oh my god, you need to develop this feature and this feature. And what happens is, like, again, it's a pie that something's got to give, right? So in some cases we will just not develop a new feature fast enough, and I'm kind of constantly in our software looking that we're not doing it. And if I see that the customer work is getting a little bit too much, what I'm doing is going to the customer success team and saying, hey folks, like, you need to manage expectation better, and say, instead of like having an SLA for whatever a bug fix or a new feature request that measure in days, maybe it can take a couple of weeks, right? Like, in order to kind of make sure that we still are able to innovate. So those are kind of some of the things. So I think it really depends. And I don't know, Mustafa, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. In our experience, at least, like Omar, when we reached about greater than 40, 50 people itself, we started seeing the need for some of this. And that might be because of, we did have a culture of metrics to start with, right? Andrew Ng and Daphne Kohler were the founders, and they were like from machine learning background. And so there was a very big data culture in the company to start with itself. So that made a difference as well. But yeah, we started seeing these cross team dependencies that Vitaly called out, like at that scale. And so those engineering operation metrics then became critical for us to have as well.
All right, it looks like we've got another question. Ozgen, I'll bring you on up.
Right. Yeah, I'm audible, I guess. Right. Mustafa, I have a very specific question. I ended up around the same percentage, 20%, I think you've mentioned, about tech foundations. That seems to be really working overall. But on the practical side of things, like I'm struggling to, like, I don't want to lean in too much. I want engineers to also identify issues, productivity gains, and drive it. I think it adds a lot to the motivation, but also sort of giving some sort of coherence to it, buckets, if you will. So what's your experience? Like, 20% for me is a no-brainer. Like, it seems to be the perfect ratio for me that works, and it has proved value. I can track it, but how I coordinate where we spend that 20% I'm looking for some insight, so I thought you might have some.
Yeah, no, that's another great question. So, the way I've split that 20% up into like 10% is for like a global engineering strategy that we all need to cross-functionally across all teams align on this and just get it done, right? And then another 10% is actually team dependent, right? So specific teams might have some specific tech debt, and I want to make sure they feel empowered to, work on that. And some teams spend 5% of that, some teams spend 10%. It depends, right? And in terms of like getting coherence on the 10% or even on the 20% is that like engineering vision, right? And what I've learned works well with the engineering vision is we used to have a 1 year OKR document for engineering as well, and then we have 4 objectives, and those 4 objectives would roughly be like, okay, developer productivity, consistent tech stack, how do we invest in people, and some buckets, right? But what I found to be more useful is that you go through an exercise of what are the impediments, what do you need to do, what is the business problem, what is the impediments, and what are the strategies you can use, and then roughly align on 3 to 4 transformations that you need to have in engineering, right? And because when people talk about vision, it's like you want to understand what are the big transformations you want to see in the next 3 years. You don't want to know like every single thing you want to do. And depending on the company, right? Like maybe there is lack of data culture and you need to, have a transformation there. Or the tech stack is just so, proliferated and you need more consistency. So maybe that's a big transformation, right? So what are the 4 big transformations for you? Like I would start with that question with your leadership team, right? Align on that, and then everything sort of like starts mapping to that in the 10% and 20%, and that gives you some coherence. And of course, at the 1 year level, this is the 3 year transformation, and at the 1 year quarterly level, you then have metrics that some of those metrics that we spoke about to track progress on those things.
Wonderful, thank you.
I have one more question. We're getting close to the end of our time. One more question to sort of, I think probably to speak to the heart of the matter for a lot of folks, and that is how do you? So this comes from Paul. So Paul, I know you're here on the call. I'm going to borrow and advocate for the question you shared ahead of time, which was this idea of how do you advocate for more resources on a tight budget? I feel like Mustafa, you've laid out some really powerful frameworks. And Vitaly, like some really great perspectives on how to think about some of these different challenges, given the context that many of us probably here on this call are asked to do more with less. How do you think about advocating for more resources on a tight budget, given some of the principles and the frameworks that you've shared so far?
Well, let me start maybe with a little bit of a contrarian because this is, trust me, I've been in those shoes. I think also one thing that we tend to think about, and this is just the life of an engineering manager, is our kind of career progress is somewhat, we think, aligned, because like one of the first questions that you get asked in a job interview is like, how large was the team that you managed? And that kind of leads us to believe that the entire goal of an engineering leader is to increase their team, because that's unfortunately, how. And there is like, I think the worst case, and apologies, Mustafa of Coursera also does this, is like when I see these leveling guides that say, in order to become a director, you have to manage at least like 20 people. Like, right? If I, quite honestly, if I see that, and that's like a public company, I would go and short their stock, because that's kind of like, that's basically a very tell things. But so that is, I would say, quite honestly, like the best thing you can do, at least for your own career, is to just completely execute with whatever resources you have. But however, since the question was asked, and kind of my personal feelings aside, maybe Mustafa, you can answer that, but you can probably kind of add your 2 cents to that.
No, yeah, completely agree. Actually, I was going to say something along the similar lines. Is sometimes actually you might end up with a goal where you don't want to backfill for a while, or don't want to hire for a while, because the more people you add, the slower you're going to get because of some bottlenecks you have in engineering or even product prioritization, right? So my job as an engineering leader is actually not necessarily to grow the team. it's to grow revenue, or like another metric to look at is R&D as a percentage of revenue and how that's tracking, right? And that's the goal of us as leaders. And yeah, and assuming, after all that, there is additional investments to be made. I think we spoke about some frameworks and tactics and metrics. And again, aligning it with the business goal is the best thing to do. The other thing to keep in mind is that do it in conjunction with your cross-functional partners, right? Just growing engineering is not going to help. Like product design, in most cases, need to map together as well. So it needs to be a cross-functional conversation as well.
Fantastic. We are coming up on the end of our time. Mustafa, Vitaly, there may be a few folks who linger around to ask some questions, but to wrap up the formal part of this conversation, number one, everybody here is going to be connected post-event. There's a lot of good conversation and insights going on in the chat. And so as folks share different things or different scenarios, you want to bounce ideas off of different folks. Like it sounds like people here are really tackling similar issues here. So it sounds like there's some great sounding boards to be had here as well. I think, let's see here. To stay in touch, Mustafa, how can people follow you? Check you out on LinkedIn. Where can they track down your 2x2 framework in the matrix? How can we find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn and Twitter both work. I think my last name is pretty unique, so it should be easy to find me.
Perfect. And yeah. Vitaly, if folks want to continue to learn more about faros.ai, stay connected with you, what's the best way to stay in touch?
Yeah, same thing. My email is firstname@faros.ai. So feel free to send me an email if you like it. And look forward to continue chatting with you folks. It's been great, and Mustafa, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Fantastic.
Oh, it was fun.
I learned a ton. You're talking about the question of what are you solving for? Engineering absolutely has to be integrated with the business strategy, asking the question of what is the key strategic thesis of the business right now and how's the engineering aligned to that. The 2x2 framework, the metric tree, some really powerful approaches here. So Mustafa, thank you so much. Vitaly, thank you. If folks want to stick around, we might be able to sneak in a few more questions, but just to close off our day, thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to come hang out and tackle this challenge and to share your challenges as well. So thank you, everybody. It was great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, folks. Unfortunately, I have to jump, but there is a member of my team here, Mahesh, who's here, and he would be happy to answer any questions. But thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, folks. I need to jump as well.
Thank you.
Awesome.